Today's 10,000 Reasons Flashback is fitting as a follow-up to the interview you've just seen. Let's go back to program number 5,535, which aired September 2nd, 1998. Our guest was Steve Saint, whose father, Nate Saint, and 4 others were killed by primitive tribesmen in the jungles of Ecuador in 1956 while serving there as missionaries. Steve was only 5 at the time, and in the many years following, Steve and others remained in that jungle area and effectively reached those tribal people with the gospel of Jesus, including Chief Mainse, who was responsible for spearing his father to death. On that program, Lorna Duick sat down with Steve along with Chief Mainse and another tribesman. This was their first trip abroad out of the jungle.
It's really not a story of 5 missionaries. It's a story about how God used 5 young missionary men and 6 fairly young Waorani men to carry out his purposes. But really, it's not a story about 11 men. It's God's story. It's a story about how God uses common, ordinary men and women who are willing to commit their lives to Him. Mainse would say, in life there are many, many trails, and each person has to decide which trail he's going to walk. But there's only one trail that leads to God's place, and that's God's trail. And if you want to get to God's trail, or you want to get to God's place, then you walk God's trail. And they call this God's markings. In their tribe, if somebody was moving, because they were semi-nomadic, they would make marks on trees. And people from their family group, reading those marks, would know how to find where they were. So that's what they call this. They call this God's carvings or God's markings. This is how God marks His trail. If you want to get to God's place, you walk His trail. And if you want to know how to follow His trail, here it is in His markings.
Well, that amazing story of violence, forgiveness, and leading a remote tribe onto God's trail has been the subject of several books, a documentary, and of course the major movie called End of the Spear. I encourage you to watch it to get the rest of the story. Well, aviation has always been a big part of Steve Saint's life and mission work, and in 2012 he was partially paralyzed during a test flight of his newly invented flying car. Well, despite his physical challenges, this resilient missionary says he's continuing to let God write the story of his life. That's just a quick flashback as we look forward to program 10,000.